Good morning. My name is, as most of you know, Kate Hansen-Bundt. I'm the leader of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, and on behalf of the committee and Civita, the think tank you all know, I have the great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar on transatlantic security 1 week before NATO's Madrid summit. Next week, NATO's leaders are gathering in Madrid to adopt a new strategic concept. We had hoped to be united on the Swedish and Finnish NATO membership and the way forward for NATO in the new security environment labeled the new normal by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. But it is, as we know, a before and a after 24th of February 2022. Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has indeed been a turning point in the post-Cold War security order, and the ongoing great power competition has brought Euro-Atlantic security back on the top of the international agenda. To discuss these great changes in our security order, we are pleased to welcome Harvard professor Stephen Walt, who is professor in international affairs at John F. Kennedy School of Government. He's a renowned expert on foreign affairs and belonged to the realist school of thinkers in international relations. Welcome, Stephen. Together with him on stage, we have invited Lieutenant General Arne Bård Dale, who after retiring from the Norwegian Armed Forces served 3 years in the OSCE in Donbass in eastern Ukraine. He has a long career in the Norwegian Armed Forces as well as in NATO, both as the Norwegian military representative to the NATO Military Committee and as the commandant in the NATO Defense College in Rome. This morning, we will first give the floor to the two speakers and then engage in a discussion with them. I will also remind you that the seminar will be streamed, and we will open for Q&As after they have delivered their introductions. So please welcome Stephen Walt to the podium.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here, despite a little bit of jet lag on my part. Kate has invited me several times to speak here in Oslo, but never at a time where I was able to accept the invitation, and I'm very glad that it worked out this time and that we can deal with this very important topic. I'm going to talk about where I think NATO is headed in light of the war in Ukraine and the rise of China. And to do that, I'm going to start by describing the situation as I saw it before the Russian invasion, and then consider what the implications of that might be. But I will also then get out my crystal ball and say where I think NATO is actually likely to head in the future, although I will confess in advance that this is also going to be where I hope NATO is headed. There is a bit of wishful thinking involved here. And to give you my bottom line up front, although the war in Ukraine has reinforced NATO's unity and cohesion for the moment, I think that level of unity is not likely to last. The bigger question NATO is going to have to deal with is the rise of China, more importantly than the war in Ukraine. And I think it is unlikely that NATO's European members will actually participate actively in an effort to balance Chinese power, especially in Asia. And I'll explain why later. So accordingly, NATO is going to need to negotiate a new division of labor, one where European members take greater responsibility for European security, and the United States focuses more time, attention, and resources in the Indo-Pacific. So let me start with some background. Where was the alliance a few years ago? Well, the answer was it was not in very good shape. President Macron of France had famously declared it to be brain dead. Both President Obama and former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates had given rather candid speeches warning Europeans that the United States was not going to keep subsidizing European defense. Donald Trump, as you all know, went even further and suggested repeatedly that he might want to take the United States out of the alliance entirely. Poland and Hungary were increasingly at odds with the rest of NATO and the European Union. Turkey was a problematic member at best. And yet, despite all of those difficulties, NATO remained committed to an open-door policy of enlargement and to eventually letting Ukraine and Georgia in as members at some point in the future. Now, at the same period, European attitudes towards China were also changing. There were growing European concerns about China's human rights policies, its policy towards Hong Kong, its behavior in the South China Sea. The new investment treaty between the EU and China was put on hold, and China was now explicitly referred to by the EU as a strategic rival. One more piece of background. In 2020, Joe Biden, a very staunch, confirmed Atlanticist, got elected the US president. So that's the situation we were in before the invasion, which brings me to that. Well, whether we like it or not, Russia had made it clear since 2008 that it was dead set against Ukraine joining NATO at any point. And they had shown in 2014 that they were willing to use force to halt any movement in that direction. Some of you may be aware that back in 2008, when Georgia and Ukraine were originally proposed for NATO membership, the then US ambassador to Moscow, William Burns, who's now the head of our Central Intelligence Agency, wrote a memo to Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, warning that Ukrainian entry into NATO was the brightest of all red lines for the Russian foreign policy elite. And this is something he said, not just the knuckle draggers in the Kremlin, but even liberal Russians were dead set opposed to it. That was what he said back in 2008. There was no prospect of immediate membership for Ukraine, but last year it began to look as though Ukraine was moving into what you might think of as a de facto membership or partnership. The United States had been arming and training Ukraine since 2017. Ukrainian forces had participated in joint military exercises. Secretary of State Blinken had signed a strategic cooperation agreement with the Ukrainian foreign minister as well. So Ukraine, although not becoming a formal member of NATO, was clearly moving closer over time. And in response, Russia mobilized troops on the border, threatened to invade if its demands were not met. The most important demand being, of course, a formal guarantee that Ukraine would not join the alliance. They got nothing in response, nothing serious in response, and Putin made good on his threats. This is, to me, something of a puzzle. Given that there was no immediate prospect of Ukrainian membership, it is, at least to me, puzzling that we did not seriously consider granting some kind of guarantee on that score. That's something I think historians will end up debating for a long time. Now, when I say that the Russian action was largely in response to what they perceived as Ukraine drifting towards NATO, I am not defending or justifying Russian behavior at all. What they have done is illegal, unwarranted, and brutal. I would add, though, it is hardly unusual behavior among major powers, and I could say more about that if you would like. It is also clear that Russia has miscalculated badly. They overestimated their own military capabilities. They underestimated the fiercity of Ukrainian nationalism, its ability to resist, and they underestimated Western resolve and unity in response to the invasion. The result, of course, you all know. Ukraine has lost territory but has retained its independence. We have imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia, which will have real long-term consequences. Germany has announced a major rearmament program that no one would have predicted a year or two ago. And Sweden and Finland have abandoned decades, if not centuries, of neutrality and want to join NATO themselves. The result here is that the Transatlantic Alliance has gotten something of a new lease on life. Unfortunately, I think the present degree of unity is at least partly illusory, and we're going to have to adapt further once the war in Ukraine ends, which it will eventually. Most likely outcome will be, I think, some sort of stalemate. Russia will not be able to subdue Ukraine, and Ukraine will not be able to reconquer Crimea or most of the eastern provinces that Russia now controls. That's not a certainty by any means, but I think that's the most likely result. And that means that eventually, when the costs become too great for either side to bear, they will cut some kind of a deal. The war has also revealed that Russian military power is not as great as many people had feared, and the war is going to leave Russia weaker over time. It has already lost a lot of equipment and men. Its economy has been hit hard by the sanctions. And more importantly, the West is not likely to go back to business as usual as long as Vladimir Putin is in power. Younger Russians with educations and skills will try to leave the country. Russia was already lagging the West and China, having trouble keeping up with those economies. It will have even more trouble doing so in the years and decades ahead. China, on the other hand, has stayed out of the fighting. It will continue to rise, despite some financial difficulties, the problems it has had managing the pandemic. And so if you take a longer-term view here, its rise is actually a far more significant strategic development than what is happening in Ukraine. And remember, the Biden administration took office intending to focus primarily on China and not on the rest of the world, and they are still trying to do so, despite the fact that their attention has been taken by Ukraine. So the really bigger question for the United States and its European allies is what's going to happen vis-a-vis China. Is Europe likely to be a major strategic partner in any active effort to contain or balance China? And let me explain now why I think that's not likely to be the case. And to do this, I'm going to have to briefly invoke some international relations theory. Historically, states form alliances and cooperate closely on military affairs when they face a common threat, a fairly obvious point. The level of threat, however, is determined by several different factors. The amount of power an opponent has, its geographic proximity, is it close by, its specific offensive military capabilities, its ability to pose a direct military threat, and finally, one's perceptions of its intentions. Right? So the more overall power a state has, the more dangerous it may appear, the more likely others are to balance against it. The closer it is, the more threatening it will appear. The more its military capabilities can do to actually hurt you, the more threatening it will appear. And finally, states or leaders who appear to want to change the status quo in a fundamental way often appear more dangerous than others. All of these factors make it more likely that other states will get together to try and balance them. And this, I think, framework helps you understand why the invasion of Ukraine triggered such a sharp European reaction. Russia may not be that powerful in an overall sense, right? Its economy is smaller than that of Italy, but it is right next door to Europe. It does have some potentially worrisome military capabilities, and it seems to be willing to take real risks to try and alter the status quo. But for Europe, the situation vis-a-vis China is very different. Now, on the one hand, China is increasingly powerful, and this has made European countries more and more concerned about how China might use its power. China's intentions do seem somewhat alarming, somewhat concerning. They do seem interested in changing the status quo in Asia, sometimes bullying weaker states in various ways. But, and this I think is the most important factor, China is also on the other side of the world, and it has no ability to threaten Europe directly. Its army is not going to march across Asia, right? Its navy is not going to sail around the world and blockade European ports or attack Europe. So it's very powerful, but it's not as threatening, at least right now, as Russia appears to be. Equally important, Europe does not have military forces that would be able to do much in a conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. If China decided to attack Taiwan, for example, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, or Norway could not do very much to affect that battle. And that situation, in my view, is not likely to change. If Europe does start rearming, as European countries are now pledging to do, they are likely to concentrate on building the ground and air forces to protect Europe, primarily against Russia, not on building expeditionary forces or naval forces designed to operate in the Indo-Pacific. I would just add, by the way, the other security issue that European countries will worry about primarily is migration, and not migration from the Indo-Pacific region as well. And that's going to be a principal strategic concern as well. And that, I think, identifies the real problem. If the United States has its hands full dealing with an increasingly powerful China and has to devote a lot of attention to Asia and the Indo-Pacific region, it is not going to want to or be able to be Europe's first responder as well. It will not have the same patience if European countries keep expecting the United States to be first and foremost in response. Once the crisis in Ukraine dies down, there is, I think, a real potential for disagreement between the United States and its European allies on this issue. Now, the solution, it seems to me, is a new division of labor, one where Europe takes greater responsibility for security in Europe, and the United States focuses more of its attention, possibly most of its attention, on balancing China in the Indo-Pacific, in partnership with its allies there. Instead of being Europe's first responder, the United States becomes its ally of last resort, to be called upon only if Europe cannot handle a security problem by itself. This means Europeans have to take the idea of strategic autonomy seriously, and it also means Americans have to stop opposing the idea of strategic autonomy, which is something the United States has generally done in the past. This doesn't, of course, mean the United States and its allies will not continue to cooperate closely on a number of other issues, whether it's cybersecurity, counterterrorism, possibly policies in the Arctic as well, although it's worth noting there are differences between Europe and the United States on some of those issues too. The good news in this story, however, is what I'm describing looks a lot more feasible now than it might have looked like a few years ago, because Russia's military limitations have been exposed on the battlefield. Russia does not look like as formidable a danger as it might have at some points in the past, which means that NATO's European members are in a position to balance Russia effectively and have the resources to do so if they choose to mobilize them properly. Remember, NATO's European members, not counting the United States, NATO Europe alone, has 3 times Russia's population, nearly 10 times its GDP, and in fact, together, these countries spend 3 to 4 times more than Russia does on defense every year. So if Russia is Europe's main security problem, it's a problem Europeans can handle, not right away, but with a bit of time and effort to get ready. Now, to be candid, and as some of you may know, I have thought for a long time that the United States and Europe should move in this direction. I thought that before the war in Ukraine broke out as well. The war, I think, has delayed the shift I'm describing, but I don't think it will or should prevent it. I also believe a more even division of labor between the United States and Europe would be in everyone's interests and would go a long way to reducing the possibility of a severe rift in transatlantic relations going forward. That is certainly what I hope will happen. That note of optimism is probably a good place to start, and I will now look forward to the General's comments and, of course, to your reactions. Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks a lot. You hear me? I'm wired up. I think this is a pretty good crowd being in early June in Oslo. And first of all, thanks a lot, Kat, for your kind introduction. Of course, the downside of such introductions are that it reminds me about how old I am, but I'll try to, to live with that. So I think that my intervention will tie in nicely with what the professor said. I will focus more directly on the upcoming summit and some of the issues related to that. But we have already touched upon, of course, the war against Ukraine, and in less than a year ago, we all lived in the post-Cold War era, like we had done for approximately 3 decades already. Of course, we all lived with the pandemic and considered that to be kind of crazy stuff. But it was coming to an end, and everything seemed to be quite normal. Of course, Russia was perceived to be a nuisance in many different ways, but not more than an annoying headache that could be managed. Large-scale war in Europe was not on our daily agenda. Most people believe that this kind of war only existed in the dustbins of history. Mr. Putin, unfortunately, taught us differently, and it's still well alive and kicking. The upcoming NATO summit will be hugely affected by Russia's war against Ukraine. And the heads of state will meet and discuss issues more seriously and more in depth. And the alliance is united and determined. Not perfect, but more than one could actually expect. However, there's a rift seen from the Eastern European countries, I think, when it comes to what they perceive as foot-dragging in Paris, Berlin, and in Rome. The impression that these countries are keen on quickly returning to business as usual with Russia, with a large-scale war raging in the middle of Europe, does not go down well in many Eastern capitals. One could say that this perception is not entirely correct, but still it is a perception. My honest opinion is that, for example, Germany has contributed more than it gets credit for. And the German government provided an overview yesterday about what they actually have contributed to Ukraine, and that's substantial. But anyway, the most important point on the agenda will, of course, be the war in Europe, including supporting Ukraine and other partners at risk. The new strategic concept has already been mentioned. Enlargement will be discussed, resources and strengthening deterrence and defense. We should expect a calm summit emphasizing unity and resolve. I will claim that the war has changed the perception of Ukraine. Today, the dominating view is a strong democratic state whose security is critical for European stability. No one would have been thinking that half a year ago. Russia's war against Ukraine is, of course, about more than Ukraine, and the West has a lot of stakes in how the end game will play out. In many ways, the desired end state in the war should be to restore the respect for internationally recognized borders. In Europe, Russia is the only country that does not respect this principle. Russia has illegally occupied part of Moldova since the end of the Cold War, areas in Georgia from 2008, and of course since 2014, of course Crimea and Eastern Donbass. And let's not forget that the outcome of this war could very well affect also other regions in the world. How the war ends should seem to be what needs the most in-depth thinking. Different people have said different things, from not humiliating Putin to regime change. This stirred up unnecessary discussion seen from my point of view. My take on the political objective, the desired end state, so to speak, is a simple one. It could be phrased something like this: a sovereign and democratic Ukraine within internationally recognized borders. One obvious implication is that Russian forces will have to leave Ukrainian territory, but you are not elaborating on how to do it or what will happen with Russia. I think also this is a very reasonable demand and something that the rest of Europe considers to be a minimum when it comes to international behavior. the respect for internationally recognized borders. I mean, why should not that apply also to Russia? However, some NATO capitals seem willing to give up Ukrainian territory in exchange for ceasefire. For all practical purposes, this would reward Putin's aggression and implicitly accept that in Europe one can still change international borders by war or conquest. The summit declaration should state the unacceptability of handing over territory to Russia, and in addition, a commitment to supporting Kyiv to such a degree that it mirrors the Western ambitions and, of course, Kyiv's ambition about the democratic and sovereign Ukraine. I think that will happen, at least in the short and medium term. Unfortunately, a conceivable scenario is Russia occupying Donbas and huge swaths of Ukraine territory. And Mr. Putin may even offer an agreement on this issue. A stalemate could be a possible development. Just to remind you, right now about 20% of Ukrainian territory is more or less controlled by Russia. Also, that would add up in European terms to about the size of Switzerland and Austria combined, to use another image. So Western leaders need to discuss such a scenario and reach some preliminary understanding of how to respond in a cohesive manner to a kind of stalemate in Donbas. Of course, the problem is that another signed agreement with Russia is just as useless as all the previous ones. The critical question will be what kind of arrangement will be needed to at least establish some credibility that Russia will adhere to a potential agreement. And the sanctions, what should be demanded from Russia to start lifting at least some of them? These are issues that I would expect the heads of state to discuss informally. So the new strategic concept. It's stated that the concept will define the security challenges facing the alliance and outline the political and military tasks that NATO will carry out to address them. This probably is the most easy point on the agenda. Mr. Putin has basically aligned NATO on most issues. The perception of Russia was actually very different in NATO before the 24th of February. The Baltic countries, Poland, and the other Eastern European countries were normally quite negative to Russia, and I can confirm that from my 6 years in NATO. And their view were normally supported by the UK and the US, to a certain degree in Norway. The East European states' perception of Russia is the one dominating today in the US NATO. And it turned out to be the most precise one, unfortunately. Russia was willing to launch a large-scale war in Europe. Also, the war has changed the perception of China for the worse. In the strategic concept, the days of cozying up with dictatorships around has come to an end. The text on China will reflect the worsening situation between China and the United States. However, China's position also in Europe is deteriorating quickly. Ms. Merkel's policy toward China is not mainstream anymore, viewed as too weak and too lenient. Political leaders from the Indo-Pacific partners will be present, underlining the stronger security connection between Asia, the US, and Europe. And I share many of the points of view of the professor when it comes to the future division of labor in NATO, because China will be a factor determining many of these considerations. So enlargement, yes. Sweden and Finland. It was expected no obstacles actually on the road to membership. Unfortunately, this was not communicated to President Erdogan. So far, the Turkish president has made life difficult for the two newcomers and present members of NATO. Actually, it should not come as a big surprise. Turkey has more or less always been the alliance loose cannon on the deck, and now it's freewheeling. However, at the end of the day, Mr. Erdogan knows he needs NATO. He will not be left out in the cold alone with Russia. I share the view that NATO is better served with Turkey as a member compared to the opposite. However, Turkey will be a headache to NATO whoever succeeds Mr. Erdogan one day. Much more likely than not, this thorny enlargement issue will be solved. Also, whatever happens, Ankara has caused irreparable damage to its own standing and reputation. The stains coming from not supporting NATO 100% at this most critical hour will not wash off easily. This will not be said openly by the heads of state in Madrid, but everyone knows it's true. Mr. Erdogan has asked Sweden and Finland to stop supporting terrorists, which could be interpreted as any political opponent of the president. He also wants the arms embargo lifted. Turkey is also looking for an opportunity to come back into the F-35 program, but that probably is too much of a stretch. Also, the country's economy is a mess. Some financial support to Ankara could be useful and much needed. The Secretary General seems quite optimistic about this issue, and so does other sources in the NATO headquarters. Of course, Sweden and Finland entering the alliance will change the fundamental geopolitics of the North and in the Baltics. The Baltic Sea will become what I've several times labeled a NATO lake. Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave, will be more isolated. In general, the coastlines in the Baltic Sea will belong to NATO countries. And up north, north of the Arctic Circle, a new huge NATO area will come into existence. And also, and that has been undercommunicated, I think, it also spells the end of what we can call neutral Europe, something that has been with us in its present form since 1945, and when it comes to Sweden, for almost 200 years. Yes, the last one, something about strong defense, credible deterrence. Obviously, that will be very much on the agenda. This year, I think one of the more sensitive issues, finances, will probably not be a topic dividing the NATO members. We should expect a strengthening of NATO forces in all countries in Europe. More forward deployed for combat formations, more pre-positioned equipment and weapons and ammunition stockpiles. Industrial war is back in many ways. Air, sea, and cyber assets will also be strengthened. The strategy calls for a new force model, the Secretary General stated recently, with more forces at high readiness and specific forces pre-assigned to the defense of specific allies to enable much faster reinforcement. All the details are obviously not ironed out by now, but for sure NATO is back in business. And much like the old NATO that I grew up with. So I like this new NATO. And anyway, some concluding remarks. As I said, this will most likely be a summit with focus on what needs to be done militarily. It will also be remembered as the summit discussing the most important enlargement for decades, Finland and Sweden. And at the end of the day, it will be the summit that connected the security dots between Asia, Europe, and the US. It goes without saying that the shadow of Russian aggression against Ukraine will be the issue driving most of the agenda. Thanks a lot. So, you have a plan for us?
I have a plan. Please sit there, Stephen. So, yes, thank you very much for interesting speeches. A little bit puzzled that none of you mentioned nuclear weapons, because both your theory, the realist theory, you mentioned the closeness, the balance of threat in a way, the closeness to the aggressor, and a lot of other criteria for being anxious and why maybe Finland and Sweden will apply for NATO membership. But none of you mentioned that this is a part of the balance of threat. Putin is actually threatening, he's rattling with his nuclear weapons. So please, Stephen, why didn't you think about these weapons?
Well, I didn't mention them, but I probably should have. Let me say what I think is the most important implication of the existence of nuclear weapons, and in particular the Russian nuclear arsenal, for what we've been discussing. And that's sort of an awkward and uncomfortable recognition that there are limits to how far one can pressure a nuclear-armed country. There are limits to how much, if you want to use the word humiliation, you can impose on Russia. Those who talked early on in the Ukraine war about how what we wanted to do was inflict a strategic defeat, weaken Russia for the long term, possibly cause regime change to happen in Russia. It seems to me that's very irresponsible discussions, however desirable those things might be, because you're dealing with a nuclear-armed country. And the reason that countries get nuclear weapons is to be able to deal what they regard as existential threats to their existence. Now, we don't have to accept their definition of what an existential threat is, but we have to at least recognize that a country that feels like it might be facing a catastrophic strategic defeat would at least contemplate using those weapons. Right? And the American Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, actually testified a month or so ago to the Senate Armed Services Committee, saying that in their judgment, the circumstances in which Russia might contemplate the use of a nuclear weapon, or possibly more than one nuclear weapon, would be a situation where they felt they were facing an existential threat, which she then defined as a possibility of a major strategic defeat. Now, however much we might want to see Russia suffer such a defeat, right, we have to recognize that that might also be extraordinarily dangerous, because that's precisely the kind of situation where a country, not just Russia, conceivably some other countries, might contemplate using a nuclear weapon as well. And that, again, puts us in the awkward position, and the general raised this, when you start thinking about the end game in Ukraine, and what the final outcome is, and getting the outcome you want might require putting extraordinary pressure on Russia. There may be limits to how much one can safely do that. And that suggests that the existence of nuclear weapons actually provides a reason for why one has to compromise. Let me just add one other point here. For those of you who know your history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, probably the closest we've ever come to a nuclear exchange, that crisis was resolved by a compromise. Much of the compromise was a secret at the time. We didn't know, for example, that the Kennedy administration had agreed to remove nuclear weapons from Turkey as part of the deal to get the Russian missiles out of Cuba. But the point is, there was a compromise reached because Khrushchev and Kennedy realized they had to unwind the crisis, and neither one was going to be able to get everything they might want. And I think the final point I'd make is that ending the war in Ukraine is going to have to involve the recognition by all parties, to include Russia, that they're not going to get everything they might have wanted when the conflict began.
But on board, a nuclear weapon is certainly a part of the Ukraine story. We remember the Budapest Memorandum, when they gave away their nuclear weapons. Ukraine would have been completely different today, wouldn't it, if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, or if Ukraine had kept their nuclear weapons?
For sure, I do agree with that perception. I think I'm known as the person that are normally not that worried about nuclear weapons, to be honest. So that's the reason why I didn't mention it. But I mean, we should remember that in 1994, I mean, if Ukraine had kept their nuclear weapons, strategic weapons basically, it would actually have been the third largest nuclear power on planet Earth. Of course, one could discuss the credibility of maintaining the force and all that. I mean, even Russia is not maintaining the nuclear forces. We should remember that the last live explosion of a device didn't even happen in Russia's time. It happened on the 24th of October in 1990, while it was still called the Soviet Union. And so there are reasons. I mean, nuclear weapons have slided in the background over the last 3 decades. And even Russia hasn't been doing any real training with nuclear weapons. So for the time being, this is not one of my main concerns. Of course, I agree that it's something that has to be taken into consideration if the situation should change a lot. But one of my concerns actually is that this irresponsible talk about nuclear weapons that we have heard from Russia, and also the diminishing position of Russia as a strategic power on a global scale, will for sure not be helpful when it comes to the anti-proliferation of nuclear weapons. I mean, Russia has been quite a serious actor in the work of restricting nuclear proliferation. But what I tend to see is that what's been happening here is an invitation to some countries, irresponsible, normally I would say, to maybe get nuclear weapons of their own. And that is actually more of a concern to me than any kind of immediate use in Europe, which I think carries a lot of problems.
I will not hold on to the nukes, but my point was just that it's used as a threat, and it's back in business in a way.
Absolutely.
That conception. Steven, I know you have argued for a long time about a new division of labor, that Europe must do much more and step up. And we see now Germany has their Zeitenwende. It has not yet materialized, but it's rhetoric at least. France is maybe stepping up. UK is stepping up in Ukraine. But in a way, during the last decades, hasn't Europe developed a kind of a defense-dependent culture where our armies and military capabilities, in a way, they make no sense without the US leadership? Who is going to lead these European capabilities, as you talked about? Of course, it's the fact. They use more money, they have capabilities, but who is going to be the leader?
I don't think it's the job of the United States to tell the Europeans who should lead a European defense capability. Americans are very good at telling other countries what to do, and you should listen to our advice maybe half the time. But one can easily imagine some intermediate steps in this direction. So and this will not happen at the summit next week, I can guarantee that, but you could imagine a situation where the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe was no longer always an American, where suddenly a French or a German or a British or whatever general could be seen as commander of SACEUR. Why not? As a step towards giving Europe greater responsibility, greater autonomy for that. The other issue here is simply that it's been very easy for Europeans to not take these responsibilities seriously, because the United States not only was willing to do it, kind of insisted on doing it, right? It's important to recognize that Americans complain about Europeans not doing enough, but on the other hand, every time the Europeans took serious steps to do more, the Americans tended to object and didn't want Europe to become too powerful. And we have to get over that as well. The capabilities are there if the Europeans are willing to assemble them and put them together in a reasonable way. And as I said in my formal remarks, the challenge is actually not as great as you might have thought. Right? If you go back a couple of years, people were starting to talk about all the enormous strides that Russian military modernization had made and how much more formidable and powerful they really were, and all of that appears to have been completely wrong. It's still basically a weaker version of the old Soviet army in a number of respects, which means Europe can, I don't want to say easily, but quite realistically develop capabilities to deal with the Russian army as it exists, not the one that people pretend used to exist on paper.
Is it so, on board, that the war scenario between Russia and Ukraine, we see that the Russian forces have problem, although it has changed during the last weeks. Would that be the same if they had attacked a NATO country? you know, you can't compare the two, can you?
No,
In military terms.
I think that, I mean, some of the problems would have been the same. I mean, what is remarkable is that, and it was alluded to, that Ukraine is actually bordering Russia. And even given the fact that Russia is bordering to Ukraine and have quite short lines of supply and all the advantages that go with geographical closeness if you want to launch offensive operations, I mean, those operations have not been effective at all. And of course, you alluded to that the situation has changed slightly over the last weeks. It's true that Russia has some progress in the Donbas area around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, an area that I, by the way, know very well. And but the remarkable is that this has been ongoing for 2 months, and they have hardly made any progress in the area. And I mean, if this should be the norm for the kind of progress they will normally make, I mean, they're not going to occupy the Donetsk Oblast before late in the autumn. So, and remember that Russia has concentrated basically all of its available military forces in this very, very small area. It's like a stamp on an envelope if you compare it to the rest of Ukraine. So I agree with what Mr. Wolf said about the perception of the Russian military power has obviously been way too exaggerated.
Do you see the leadership role in Europe?
The leadership role in Europe.
Who is going to lead Europe? Isn't it so that US has been a pacifier for European states during the post-war?
Yes, I would say that it's something that we could, on a way, be leading on and not doing what we actually should have done. I mean, to be honest, everyone knows that I'm not a great admirer of the previous president, but when it comes to burden sharing, he did have a point. We cannot avoid that conclusion. And I certainly share the point of view that there will be a different burden sharing in Europe during this new period. If you like to call it a new Cold War or not, it depends, but there will be different. And of course the difference was that it will never again happen that the United States will have permanently deployed 400,000 soldiers in Germany. So there will be American soldiers in Europe also in the future, but the numbers will be far less than it used to be. And Europe will have to carry more of that burden from its own budget. That's obvious, and we have briefly touched upon it. China is the reason in the background. I mean, there are limits to what the US can commit to Europe, given the fact that China is rising up as a peer competitor.
Of course.
Yeah. So there we are.
I have one more question before I will involve the audience. Please give signs to my people, Christine over there and Camilla somewhere, because I don't see anything, because it's a light just in my eyes. So, but I can't leave. You said that the former president, Donald Trump, had one good point, and I know that Stephen Walt also gave him some good points. In his book, when you wrote in 2018, the book, The Hell of Good Intentions, where you criticized the blob, or what Donald Trump maybe called the swamp. The foreign policy elite in Washington, who has stood behind the idea of a US-led liberal hegemony in the world. How do you see the current administration? Is the blob still there? Or have they thought a little bit more in your line as the realists?
The short answer is no, not really, no. And the Biden administration is very much a return to sort of the traditional American foreign policy elite. I mean, Biden himself is an absolute mainstream representative of sort of centrist American foreign policy thinking going back decades. The people he appointed are all sort of perfect examples of the kind of phenomenon, and that's not all a bad thing. As we've just said, Donald Trump may have said a few correct things about burden sharing. Of course, when he said that, he was saying the same thing that Obama had said, that George W. Bush had said, all the way back to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Americans have complained about that. And that may have been the only good thing that Donald Trump said about foreign policy. The chapter on Trump in my book is called How Not to Fix Foreign Policy. But yes, the Biden administration very much, I think, wanted to return to most of the familiar principles that American foreign policy had been based on for a long time. And you'll note also that very strong emphasis at the beginning on democracy versus dictatorships. On human rights was going to be the centerpiece of American foreign policy, is what Secretary of State Blinken said. That Saudi Arabia was going to be treated as a pariah state, which is no longer the case, by the way. So these were all very familiar themes, and unfortunately those themes have come up against reality in a number of obvious ways. But yes, it's very much, I think, a traditional sort of non-realist foreign policy.
But probably Trump, one exception is his China policy. And that has certainly been continued by the current administration, and is more in your line of thinking that they have to counter China on trade policy and so forth, isn't it?
Trump and many other people, Trump was not the leader in this, were taking China much more seriously. You'll recall it was the Obama administration that first started talking about a pivot to Asia. So we've seen that coming because it is a big structural change. Trump took it to another level. He just took it there in a rather inept and incompetent way, launching a poorly designed trade war, not taking the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had an important strategic role in Asia. So he recognized the problem the same way his predecessors had and the same way the Biden administration has. I don't think he pursued it particularly effectively.
No. So he made the diagnosis, but he didn't prescribe the good medicine or the right medicine in Europe. Let's open for some questions from the audience. Okay.
My name is Tone Rand. Thank you for very interesting presentations. Over the last years, we have been witnessing growing geopolitical tension. I would appreciate your views on the development of the situation in the Arctic. How is it likely that the rivalry between the US, Russia, and China will develop in the future? Norway has been defined as NATO in the north. How do you think that Norway's position will develop when Sweden and Finland become NATO members? Thank you.
We collect a couple of questions, I think. We have some here in the front. Janne, you will be provided with a microphone.
Thank you, Professor Janne Matlari, Command and Staff College and University of Oslo. I see that in a way it's an opportunity. I agree with your assessment of the transatlantic burden sharing and relationship in the future. And this war then provides an opportunity for Europe to contribute to weakening Russia conventionally as much as possible in order for Europe to be able to play the lead role which it has to play after the war. I watch very much the leadership sort of question in Europe, and now Britain is in the lead with the US clearly in the coalition. France has suffered from both AUKUS and an election that went badly. But France and Britain are the only leaders possible, nuclear powers, so they have to get back in a way. France has to find a way back to be with Britain. So there's a certain worry on the part of scholars here in Europe that we see that each time there's a real crisis, it's the US that has to lead. It happened after 2015. It happened now. It has happened several times previously. So right now the relationship UK, France is very poor. So this is, of course, this is not for the Americans to resolve. It's for the Europeans to resolve. So that's just a comment. My question is really on enlargement, escalation. We have, if you look at the map, Bosnia, possibly Serbia in the future. That's an interesting point for NATO. Bosnia, before Srpska can secede, should perhaps be more on the road to membership. And the Serb Vukic was the one who didn't want Lavrov coming 2 weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, asking the Bulgarians to close the airspace, which is interesting. He's distancing himself from Russia. So here's an opportunity for NATO. Is there any discussion at all about enlargement in the Balkans? And as for escalation, any comment on the Lithuania railroad closure, which seemed was a surprise, and I was wondering what is the legal basis for that? It seemed an invitation to escalation. Thank you.
Thank you. We leave the microphone there because I know that Sverre will have the next question, but I think we should give the two speakers the chance to respond.
Okay. I don't consider myself an expert on Arctic policy at all, so I'm going to be very brief there. I'll just say that what's now happening in the Arctic, of course, with climate change is fascinating, and it raises all sorts of potential problems. I think that the addition of Finland and Sweden to NATO, assuming that happens, will strengthen NATO's position vis-a-vis the Arctic, and therefore strengthen Norway's position. I can imagine there might be some frictions between the Nordic states on these issues, but I think those are going to be relatively minor compared to the potential for trouble with others. I'd also mention that this is one of those areas where China and Russia don't necessarily agree. Right? When China declares itself to be a near Arctic nation, as a way of trying to assert that it has interests in the Arctic as well, even though it is not a literal state in the Arctic. This is, of course, a source of tension with Russia, because Russia wants to control as much of the Arctic as it possibly can, and doesn't necessarily want China interfering or getting involved there. China's main interest in the Arctic, apart possibly from some resources, is potential sea lines of communication, and it doesn't want anyone interfering with sea lines of communication up there. I think that would include Russia as well. So this is one of those issues where China and Russia are not necessarily going to be perfectly aligned going forward. As for the question about the Balkans and the Serbs, I have not followed this closely at all, so I wouldn't be willing to say. I will say that I'm always concerned by the idea that NATO enlargement is always a good thing, that it's somehow this wonderful security blanket or this magic act that solves problems rather than causes them. And I think there are some circumstances in which enlargement has solved problems and made things more stable, and there are other circumstances where it hasn't. And I think, tragically, Ukraine is one where the Bush administration's decision to put Ukraine and Georgia forward at 2008, something that the rest of Europe was not enthusiastic about, was ultimately an enormous misstep. That had we not taken that step back in 2008, we would not be facing the situation we are facing today. So again, I worry a little bit that people believe that once you bring something into a country into NATO, all problems disappear. Oh, and that brings me to the Lithuania question at the end. I just have picked up on what's actually going on there and reading about it, but I do think this illustrates a danger we should not lose sight of, which is that if the war in Ukraine continues as a stalemate over months, as I think is likely to happen, the temptation to escalate is going to go up. Neither side is going to want to give up. You'll see more pressure on the United States and others to do something to lift the blockade, to get food out. And that's a potentially risky escalatory step. It might be the right thing to do, but it is not without risks. I can imagine Russia thinking of things it wants to do to try and increase pressure on Ukraine. I can see that the situation in Lithuania being interpreted by Moscow as an escalation of this that requires some response. So we should not assume that the conflict in Ukraine is going to remain confined to Ukraine. The effects are already being felt all over the world, and that also means that others may start getting involved in ways that we haven't really anticipated.
On the board, do you have any comments?
Just a few small comments. I mean, up in the Arctic, and other issues that most people maybe not think about all the time, but the countries having a border up in the Arctic are basically all NATO countries, with the exception of Russia. So, of course, the problem with Russia in general is going to transmit also to up north. And I've said a long time that we will have a much more, seen from Oslo, a much more complicated relationship to Russia in the future. I mean, the Russia we see walking around in Ukraine and doing what they do in Ukraine is exactly the same Russia as we should expect hanging around here if we are going into any kind of problem with Russia. So I foresee a lot of challenges for the Arctic cooperation and Norway and the policy in general for the northern areas. About this France-UK leadership role, I think it's fair to say that this Russia's war against Ukraine has diminished the possibility of Germany and France playing any role as a security guarantist for example, the Eastern European countries. The conclusion, I'm sure, is in the Eastern European capitals that the only two countries that seem to be able to provide security when the situation is dire is the UK and the United States. I mean, the two others have been written off, seen from for example, Warsaw. And I briefly alluded to that in my introductory remarks. So that will be a fallout from what's been going on. The Balkans and enlargement. I tend to agree that enlargement is not solving any problems. It can, I mean, not solving all problems, but it could solve some. Integrating some of the countries in the Balkans is a kind of risky game. I mean, we could see some of them backsliding politically. And we already have new NATO members from the Balkans that have backslided in the direction of Russian influence. So, and remember, consensus is needed in NATO. So I would be hesitant to accept more members into NATO that has the potential for political backsliding from democracy and into something God knows what could possibly be. And of course, the situation with Lithuania, Kaliningrad, I briefly mentioned that in my introduction. Of course, it's an isolated enclave in the Baltic Sea. And the Baltic Sea seems to end up kind of NATO lake, the word I used. And obviously, it's a possibility to put pressure on Russia, since this small enclave doesn't have any connection over land to Russia. Of course, what Lithuania says is they are just enforcing the EU sanctions. That's all. And Washington came out just a few hours ago strongly in support of Lithuania. So I really don't see that Russia has much that can affect the situation within in Lithuania.
Thank you. What you said about the leadership in Europe, I think that you are very right, because the UK and the US are seen, that's also behind the Finnish and Swedish membership application. It's nothing, they are EU members. They have the solidarity guarantees from EU, but it doesn't, in a way, have any value for them at the moment. However, we have more questions. Sverdisen, please.
Professor, Thank you for sharing your insights with us this morning. My name is Sverre Diesen. I'm a former Chief of Defense here in Norway and currently with the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. And although I totally agree with your opinion about the need for more European self-sufficiency, I'm also a bit in doubt about whether this is going to happen or not. And there's not just the leadership question. There is also the fact that we, the Europeans, need to spend our budgets more sensibly than we do at the moment. To use just an example, that would take the British Army driving around in German tanks if they are the best ones. And knowing the British Army, that's not going to happen, in my opinion, not in the short term anyway. But that brings me to the leadership question, and it seems to me that NATO in many ways is an organization which is really about two things. There is the political NATO, which is about ideals and principles, the open door policy, any democracy meeting the requirements should be allowed to join, and so on and so forth. And then there is the military perception of NATO as a military alliance, which, like all military alliances, lives or dies by its military credibility. And to give you just a point, going back to my time on the military committee, I was talking to the then Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Jim Jones, and this was back at the time when the US administration was working very hard to get Georgia and Ukraine into the alliance. And so I asked General Jones what he thought about that, and he said that's insane. The reason being that, first of all, there's no way NATO can give Ukraine a security guarantee worth the paper it is written on. The only thing we achieve is to confirm President Putin's narrative about NATO encroaching on Russia from all sides. And thirdly, Ukraine is not going to bring anything to the NATO table for years and years. And now this was, in all fairness to them, back in 2009, but still. So in your opinion, is that a fair description of the alliance, the sort of the political alliance versus the military? And do you see a way of bringing the two together? Thank you.
Thank you. Time is running fast. Board, give the Sverre. Yep. I think we have to collect a couple or more people. And maybe if you say who of the speakers you want to answer your question, if it's a directly question, right. We'll save some time.
Right. I think I'll ask my question to Stephen. So what we've just been hearing is the extreme dependency of Europe on US capabilities. We see that in this conflict. We see that the C-17s that are delivering munitions, the munitions themselves, etc., 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 are essentially American. At the same time, China is now 75% of US GDP, about twice as large as the Soviet Union at any point. And they have the largest navy. They have just pushed its third aircraft carrier into the sea in only 4 years. And isn't it quite concerning, the comments that we're hearing about the problems that Europe would have finding a leadership role, that they would have trouble building up the necessary capabilities over time? And what do you see that as leading to over the period that you mentioned as necessary to build those capabilities? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm happy if you keep it short and sweet. We have Odd Skagestad behind there.
Thank you. Odd Gunnar Skagestad. I am an old age pensioner and independent analyst. I'm going back to the opening part of Professor Walt's statement. His crystal ball predictions about the main issues at the upcoming summit, which naturally will be Ukraine and China, in that order. Ukraine the most urgent, and China possibly the most important in the long run. I may or may not agree with that, but in any case, I think NATO will be well advised by handling one challenge at a time. to cross one bridge at a time, so to speak. With regard to the present situation, I see a distinct trend towards war fatigue in NATO. Not directly big splits between major NATO countries, but at least a certain impatience with the progress that's not being made. Well, statements indicative of this is, of course, Henry Kissinger's suggestion that we trade territory for a ceasefire agreement. And also President Macron, when he talks about the necessity of not humiliating Putin too much. If this is a scenario, in my mind, it raises a specter of Munich, 30th of September 1938, his return to London of Prime Minister Chamberlain, who waived this document, which was supposed to mean peace in our time. Winston Churchill later on said that they had a choice between disgrace and war. They chose disgrace and got the war. How do you see this, Professor Walt? How do you see this analogy between Hitler's actions in the late 1930s and the present situation with Mr. Putin's actions in Ukraine? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I will give you the chance to answer now before we get some other questions. Please, Stephen.
Yeah, so...
A couple of questions on China, at least.
Yeah, I'm going to take these two kind of together because they did sort of fit, my apologies if I'm not entirely coherent about this. I mean, I think we ought to step back for a second and remember why NATO was formed in the first place. Right? NATO was a defensive alliance formed in response to the belief or the fear that the Soviet Union might try to conquer Western Europe. That was the central reason for forming it. And it was a very unusual development. It was the first time in American history that we had committed ourselves to a peacetime alliance overseas. And, as was stated, kept a lot of troops in Europe for that purpose. Quite an unusual thing to do. And you want to ask, well, why did the United States decide to do that? Well, we had decided that the Soviet Union posed a particular threat at a particular time, and the European countries could not deal with that threat on their own, particularly given the condition they were in at the end of World War II and all the damage they had suffered. Well, over the next 70 or 80 years, NATO had become this almost sacred institution. Right, and for a lot of political reasons. And never mind that the politics was often a little bit hypocritical and a little bit inconsistent, right? There were NATO members that weren't democracies at various points. There are NATO members that have been backsliding quite explicitly, Hungary probably most visibly as a commitment to those democratic values or whatever. But you want to remember what the underlying strategic logic was. The United States committed itself to European security because we didn't want any single hostile power to control all of those resources. That's why we entered World War I. That's why we entered World War II. That's why we formed NATO and remained committed to Europe. Then you want to ask yourself, now the question is any country threatening to dominate Europe the way Wilhelmine Germany, Nazi Germany, or the Soviet Union might have tried to do? And the answer is no. There's no country that can dominate Europe. Germany can't dominate it, France can't dominate it, Britain can't dominate it, and Putin's Russia absolutely cannot dominate it. Right? Lacks the capabilities. Remember, this is a country whose economy is smaller than Italy's or Canada's. It's not taken over Europe. It's having enough trouble occupying eastern Ukraine. It's not going to drive through Poland and then through Germany and then all the way to the English Channel and threaten London. Right? This is a fantasy. And if that's the case, then you want to ask yourself, what's the American strategic interest in a large commitment in Europe, a significant defense commitment? It's good for Lithuania. It's good for Poland if Americans want to defend them. But you at least want to ask the question of what's in it for the United States. Particularly, and this gets to your point, if we're dealing with an emerging peer competitor with 3 times our population, eventually a larger GDP that's beginning to turn all of that into some military power, the United States should be focusing all of its strategic effort, or much of its strategic effort, against China, and trying to minimize the degree to which it's distracted by problems in parts of the world where there isn't a peer competitor that we really need to worry about. That does get to the very important question of European strategic leadership, and you do have to worry that if the United States is not, quote unquote, leading the alliance, no one will be able to. My concern is that the Europeans will not get their act together, either within the European Union or within a NATO where the United States is playing a less significant role, unless and until the United States stops doing that. Right? That it is just simply, sorry to put it in these terms, it's just too easy for Europeans to continue to defer to Uncle Sam as long as every time they call up, you can get the Biden administration. You could even get the Trump administration to respond. For all of Trump's bluster, he actually did more. He sent more troops to Eastern Europe. He was the one who started arming Ukraine in 2017 while he was president. If you can get Donald Trump to do that, you can easily get Joe Biden and any members of the American political mainstream. Final comment I'll make is I don't think that the situation in Ukraine has, the Munich analogy has anything to do with the situation in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin does not want to try and take over all of Europe. I don't think he wants to create the old Soviet Union. It is Putin, for example, who has said something along the lines of, anyone who doesn't miss the old Soviet Union has no heart. And speaking of Russians, anyone who thinks we can get it back has no brain, right? So I think the Munich analogy is actually should be put to bed for at least 100 years because it has been misused ever since. It doesn't apply. That doesn't defend what Russia's doing. It just suggests that the path by which we went to war in 1939 is very different than the path that had led to war in Ukraine today. So I don't think that analogy does much work for us.
Okay. Do you have a short comment?
Yes, pretty briefly, I will touch upon the questions about the possibility of having any kind of peace agreement. And I do agree that the Munich analogy is probably not a good one. And you all recall that it was the World Economic Forum in Davos 2 or 3 weeks ago, and basically they didn't talk about the future, but they did talk about 1940, 1938, 39, and so on and so on. And Kissinger said those words about giving up Ukrainian territory. And then we are into this kind of challenge. What is it that Putin wants? And it's very hard to say because he has said different things. On the 9th of June, on the 350th anniversary of Peter the Great, he basically talked about restoring the historical borders of Russia, whatever that might be. It could be the Muscovite borders that was a small ring around Moscow in 1471, or it could be the Empire of 1914, which also included Finland. So it's kind of difficult to say. So, and he has come across with some of those words several times. So it's difficult to say exactly what he's thinking. But anyway, the problem with having a kind of discussion about the ceasefire or a kind of peace agreement or whatever it is nowadays, if you should start that process, is implicitly that you accept that Russia will be given some kind of reward for what it has done. And that's the big issue, actually, and that's also probably what will divide the European countries in the future. Ukraine and many Eastern European countries are concerned that countries like Germany and France will be willing to give up Ukrainian territory for some kind of peace, ceasefire, whatever. Of course, the challenging issue that comes up immediately, and I alluded to that in my introduction, should we trust Russia? What does it mean if Moscow signs a new agreement about what to do and not to do in Ukraine? It doesn't matter. They have signed a gazillions of agreements already, the whole Helsinki process and the Budapest Memorandum, guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty within international recognized borders. So it really doesn't matter. And that's the reason why it is so difficult to find some kind of starting point. foreseen from Kiev. They say they want 2 agreements. They want one agreement with Russia, if it's possible to find an agreement. And then they want another one that with maybe some NATO countries, US, whoever, that should guarantee that Russia will behave in accordance with what it has signed up to. And of course, all this lack of trust. And the big question at the end of the day is it at all acceptable when we talk about ethics to give up people and territory to a country that has basically said they are going to exterminate the Ukrainians? They discuss that on Russian television every day.
Thank you, Arne. I would challenge you on that, Stephen, because how is the end state of the Ukraine war in a realist, theoretical thought?
I agree with almost everything that was just said. And I think that in any peace agreement, you have to worry about the possibility of one side or the other reneging on the deal. What makes the deal stick once it's put in place? And I think that it's actually even harder than you might think, because that same problem applies on the Russian side. Suppose Russia ends up with Crimea and a slice of the East at the end, and they all sign that. The Russians will want some reassurance that the Ukrainians aren't going to try to retake it 5 years from now or 6 years from now. If I were the Ukrainians, I might well want to do that, and Russia won't sign the deal unless they feel there are some assurances that maybe the Ukrainians make a pledge, all right, we're going to remain a neutral country. Russia would like to know, well, does that mean for 6 months? Does that mean for 5 years? You'll recall that before the war started, one of the Russian demands was that Ukraine be a neutral country, not join NATO, and the United States. They didn't want this deal with the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians had gone back and forth on this question for a while. They wanted a pledge from the United States that that wouldn't happen. So does that mean the United States, as part of some peace deal, if that's part of the terms, has to? What I'm just suggesting is none of us know what these terms are going to look like, and it's going to be very difficult to reach them until both sides are sufficiently desperate for peace, having suffered, unfortunately, a great deal. That's why I think it's not premature to start thinking about the problem. It is probably premature to expect there to be any meaningful discussions about it at this point, because each side still has expectations that they can get what they want at an acceptable cost as well. So that's one of the reasons I think this is going to continue for some time, which is first and foremost a tragedy for Ukraine, because the country is being wrecked in the process. Right? That's something to bear in mind as well. And finally, when we start thinking about these guarantees, and I'll speak now just as an American, other countries have some reasons to question our fidelity, our ability to deliver on pledges. A couple of presidents ago, we signed a deal along with our European Union colleagues and Russia and China with Iran, right, over Iran's nuclear program. Then we had a presidential election, and the next president tore the deal up. Other countries, therefore, have to worry that they reach a deal with one American administration and the next one decides not to abide by it. I think that's, again, a self-inflicted wound on our own diplomacy. But if I were sitting in Moscow, I would at least occasionally ask myself, can I trust America's word? The same way that we ask ourselves, could we trust Putin's word? And there's some reasons for doubt in both cases.
Okay. Thank you. I have a lot of questions. We have 6 minutes to go. So I just have to pick 3 of you. And I know the guy over there had his hand up for a long time ago. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief. My name is Håvard Sandvik. I work as a foreign policy staffer here in the Norwegian Parliament. My question goes to Professor Walt. I follow you when it comes to this discussion of division of labor between the US and Europe on security in Asia and Europe, but I wonder if there is a limit to it, because above and beyond the capabilities that the Americans bring to the table in Europe, there's also the presence of US forces also has a great political impact and proves and demonstrates the US security commitment to Europe. So my question is, are there limits to that? And my other very brief question to both of you is, where do you see the longer-term perspective for Georgian membership of NATO now in light of what's going on with Finland, Sweden, and the war? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And then Hilda, over there.
Thank you. Hilda Restad, Associate Professor of International Studies here in Oslo. Nice to see you again, Professor Walt. We've talked about democratic backsliding of members of NATO, but the most important member of NATO that is currently democratic backsliding is the United States. So if you weren't from the US, just as an IR theorist, how would you assess the reliability of the US as an ally going forward? I'm thinking, for instance, of the problem that might arise if the process with Finland and Sweden going on too long and there being a midterm election in the US and the Senate composition changing and perhaps the US Senate no longer voting in favor of Sweden and Finland being taken into NATO.
Thank you. And then we have one girl over there. Lady, maybe.
Thank you. My name is Kristin Grostad. I am a researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. My question goes to Stephen, and it's twofold. So the first part of the question, I'm also interested in the division of labor. And I'm wondering how you see nuclear weapons fit into this division of labor. Do you see France and the UK maintaining their deterrent vis-a-vis Russia, or do you see that as being a part of what the US brings to the table? And the second part is more theoretical, because you mention and you talk a lot about how alliances form and that you need a common threat. But how can you have an alliance that is based on two different threat perceptions and two different threats altogether? So if you have a division of labor where the US is mostly concerned with China and Europe is mostly concerned with Russia, how do you see that alliance working when they don't have the same threat perception? And do you see a scenario in which the US will be altogether concerned with China and will not come to Europe's aid? And then maybe bring that back to the nuclear part of it. And how do you see the strategic stability between Russia and the US developing in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I can't leave you, Stephen, without asking a question from your latest column in Foreign Policy, where you have an article, "Why do people hate realism?" Could you end our morning here to dig into that a little bit? We had John Mersheimer, your colleague, here on a web a couple of months ago. I got so much criticism for inviting him. So that's maybe the story behind why you wrote this column. Why does people hate realism?
Okay. So the limits to division of labor, I guess. I mean, you have to, I think, the issue is not the number of American troops, right? That's has some important symbolic value, and in some contexts it would have obviously important military consequences. But first of all, there is a treaty commitment there. If you believe treaties matter at all, that says something. More importantly, one has to ask, and I did raise this question earlier, what is the American interest? And it seems to me if Europeans think it is in America's interest to defend them, then it's a much more credible commitment. If Europeans begin to wonder what's in it for the United States, then you ought to ask whether the United States would come to your defense or not. And putting more troops in a particular place doesn't necessarily change those I think, more fundamental questions. As a practical matter, I imagine the United States will stay formally a member of NATO, even if we have a different division of labor, and there would be a small number of American troops for largely symbolic purposes and to occasionally conduct an exercise or two. But the idea would be to keep it at a sufficiently small level that Europeans understand that in a world where hard power still matters, Europeans are going to need some. And they can't just borrow it from us whenever it comes due. That's simply a recognition. If Europeans aren't willing to make that decision, and that's entirely up to the Europeans, it seems to me you have every reason to expect the United States will eventually say, fine, we have other problems that are more important. You're on your own, right? Which a number of American leaders before Donald Trump said, including the former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, and I think his final speech at a NATO meeting as well. A second question I had here was the backsliding United States. This is a real concern that I have living in the United States, irrespective of its foreign policy implications. I'll just make it broader. This problem is not going to go away in the United States, but also elsewhere, including here in Europe. You know, I don't think you want to rule a Marine Le Pen presidency out yet, despite the results of the last French presidential election. I think in a world where economies are still going to be doing badly, where the war in Ukraine is affecting all of that, where some of the foreign policy initiatives undertaken by the mainstream don't work out particularly well, etc., the appetite for populism, and here in Europe, if you get more waves of migration coming from Africa and elsewhere, as a result of situations there, including the famine that will be induced by the problems in Ukraine, I think the potential for continued democratic backsliding in the United States and elsewhere, which then has significant foreign policy implications, is non-trivial. So I tend to agree with that as well. In terms of the division of labor, what about separate threats? If Europe is focused primarily on Russia and migration, the United States focused primarily on China, I do think that's a real problem. That over time you really could imagine it sort of really just a separate problem, and trying to define the world as one of democracy versus autocracy won't be enough. I think the greater danger, though, is very high expectations, where Americans are expecting Europeans to help them out in Asia, right? And cooperate in embargoes on China and imposing lots of limits and maybe sending some naval forces to Asia, not just symbolically, a frigate every now and then, but something really serious. If that's our expectation, we're going to be disappointed and we're going to be angry, and that's going to produce problems. So the reason I like the division of labor is that gets worked out between the United States and its European partners, and we're happy with what you're doing, you're happy with what we're doing. We see it as collectively in our interest. I may be too optimistic. And then why do people hate realism? You can go to the foreign policy column for the full depiction. Just a couple of things. People don't like realism for the obvious reason. It's a very pessimistic outlook on the world, right? It does suggest that in a world where there's no central authority to govern world politics, to keep states from fighting, it's going to happen. Insecurity is going to remain a problem, and there's not a whole lot you can do to eliminate that. It's just a condition of life. Realists, I think, are falsely accused of being amoral, not caring about morality at all. I think that's actually wrong if you look at the record. They are sometimes accused of being hawkish, right? They like war. They think it's wonderful. I think, again, that's a false depiction. If you look at least at American realists going back to the 1950s, we've tended to be on the dovish side of a lot of big questions like Vietnam, like the Iraq War, etc., as well. So it's not the case that we're either amoral or hawkish, but many people see it in that way. And then finally, people don't like realism because it seems to minimize human agency. Right? We have no capacity to change this. I don't think that's right either. At the margin, we can do smarter or dumber things. When we do smarter things, we tend to reduce the amount of trouble in the world. On my last point, some people don't like realism because we have this annoying tendency to be right. Not all the time. No theory of international politics is perfect by any means, and realists get some things wrong at sometimes, but we have been, I think, on balance, a more accurate analysts and predictors of what was likely to happen than others.
Okay, if you haven't read it, go to Foreign Policy and read the column 13th of June or whatever, and then you will know more about why the realists are right. Thank you very much for spending the morning with us, Stephen Walt and Arne Bård Dalhaug. This has been very fascinating.
Thank you.
And a a very good summer to all of you. This was the last seminar from the Atlantic Committee and Civita. I don't know about Civita, but for this June.